Hello, this is Stefan Bertram and Ben Burgess bringing you philosophy for the people. Hello, Ben.
Hello. Do we not have a background for this? Is the black background just what we use?
Yeah, we don't have a background. I mean, we could like take a screenshot of the intro and upload it if you wanted to have some gradation columns. But I ever just use the blank one, the completely
Uh,
blank one, or the almost blank TIL one.
all right. Well, we'll talk to Jason about it later. Get
Then,
the get
are
some
are philosophers more important, or are farmers more important?
philosophers or farmers. The farmers are a lot more important to the continued existence of the philosophers than vice versa.
True. Um, But I think today, at least on my end, is going to be a day of hating on farmers. It only
Okay.
kind of slightly comes up in the text, but I think there is. If you
Okay.
dig in,
So
you can find some
we'll
farmer hate
we'll look
implied
forward
in what Ben wrote today and what
to your
Marx wrote today.
many objections to farmers. We'll look forward to today. Um,
They're
I'm,
bygones. But some people,
uh,
the kind of the left, center, right, post, pre populist movement have been getting horny about farmers lately because they're blocking capitals and stuff.
yeah, yeah. There is actually an interest in something interesting there. I think.
It's like, oh yeah, this is your revolutionary class.
Yeah. See in the chat.
If they were peasants, they'd be more revolutionary. They're not.
Yeah, I mean the word peasant is pretty flexible though, right? So like the sort of main usage of it is to mean like peasants on feudal estates, right? That's your sort of like classic peasant, somebody who might or might not exactly be a serf, but is but has like has like obligations to the lord of the estate, and their own little plot of land, and all of that stuff. But I do notice that the word peasant in different historical contexts gets thrown around a lot to describe a lot of things that aren't really that.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to some people about. They were wondering like why do these people in Wheel of Time, the TV series, these farmers have like books and stuff because they're like peasants, and so shouldn't they just be like rolling around in the mud at all times?
as,
Like
as
constantly
peasants,
scrabbling to drink water or whatever. And it's like,
as
no, these are
peasants
like
always did.
these are yeomen. Like they're small landowners who don't have a feudal lord. They're not peasants in any way that you understand.
Yeah, right. I mean, and this is, although this also gets, so this is like the sort of thing I'm thinking of here. Like people talk about like the Russian Revolution, and they'll talk about the worker peasant alliance in contexts where people had just become essentially right, yeomen. But yeah, no, I think that's right, like that. So and when my half joking response earlier to who's more important, was also, I was thinking of farmer as like anybody who's doing farming, which is something that like all societies need, right? To someone or something, maybe it could be fully
So
automated.
far,
To yeah, I mean eventually maybe we'll have the replicator from
are the
Star
guys
Trek.
in the gene labs will they be farmers?
Yeah, I guess you'll have some real gray area cases of people of what counts as farming. But yes, at least given current technology, you do need someone somewhere doing some sort of agricultural labor. Although, importantly, for what we're going to get into, you need a whole lot less of it now, given the current technology level of technology, than you needed for the vast majority of human history, right? I mean, like you need a much smaller percentage of the population doing agricultural labor to support the amount of agriculture that it actually takes to feed everybody now, than whereas for like pretty much all of human history, at least if you're counting history as starting at the agricultural revolution, everything else is prehistory, then like up until very recently, pretty much everybody, was a farmer, statistically speaking. It's just, which is, which is also, of course, progress.
Yes, outlined in Capital Part 1, if you're interested. But Ben, I think only a mind as great as mine could connect this issue to Palestine. So, do you want to kind of explain to our audience what the connection is?
Sure.
What your essay this week is about?
Yeah. Um, it's funny, by the way, as we were about to start streaming today, I was thinking, oh, yeah, it's Easter. I wonder if people are doing something that means they're not watching. And then I kind of realized as I was thinking about it that I only have the vaguest idea of how people celebrate Easter. Like,
Yeah, I
I
mean,
basically,
one of my opening jokes was going to be saying Happy Easter to you. Just,
yeah, I almost literally don't know. I mean, I know about Easter baskets, right? And I know obviously that some people go to church, but if you don't go to church and you don't have small children you're giving like chocolate bunnies to, it's actually kind of a mystery to me. Like I hear people refer to celebrating Easter. I don't really know what they mean, but
uh, I've been going to supermarkets as I do, as one needs to do if you're not a farmer.
sure, sure.
Um, and in something I'm sure upsets Peter Hitchens a great deal. I noticed that British Easter is just fully paganized now. At least in kind of the stuff that they sell you in shops, it's all just fertility rites. It's all sheep, it's all lambs, sunflowers, and rabbits.
All right. Yeah, so you're now celebrating Easter in the style of the Isle Summer Isle. Um
True.
but fair enough. Okay, yeah. So the essay has to do with the part of the world where Easter comes from, although relatively few people celebrate it. Uh, yes, where are Pascal and Gene? That's no shows, I say. Yeah. So, and in fact, right at this point, there is a Palestinian Christian population is relatively small and getting rapidly smaller. But in any case, so the essay is about Israel-Palestine, which is something that I've written about quite a bit. I've for a few places, but mostly for Jacobin. I think I counted it up, and at the time that I wrote this, I'd written 19 Israel-Palestine articles for Jacobin over the years. Now it's 20 because one came out today, and the first 18 of those 19 I got plenty of hate mail about, but always from Zionists, right? That there's people who were very mad at me, and depending on which bits of my family background they knew or guessed about, I either thought I was an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. Um, and and
Yeah, I mean, you really look like a genteel.
this is it, as the case may be, right? But then the 19th was different, right? The 19th, they caused quite a bit of controversy, and some of that was actually still from Zionists who were mad about it, but most of it wasn't, right? Yeah,
And
exactly.
it was doing numbers too, and like bad numbers. I mean, whatever. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
all
yeah, yeah,
publicity is good publicity, but people were big mad.
yeah, yeah.
Like
The anger at
500 quote tweets or whatever.
yeah, the anger was doing numbers. Exactly. Yes, my Palestine Jacobin articles are one away from being able to order a drink in the United States. But in any case, yeah, it's so there was it generated a lot of controversy, like a lot. Like I thought it would generate some, right? When I wrote it, but I certainly didn't expect anything like as much as it did. I actually found it kind of interesting that it did as much as it did, but it's but yeah, this was overwhelmingly from people who basically agree with me about a lot of the underlying issues, right? So in other words, people who certainly agree with me that about the call for a ceasefire right now, but like beyond that, right? People who agree with me that with you know a lot of the more sort of even outside of the sort of current horrors, a lot of the more fundamental objections to the Zionist project, and and the sort of way that Israel's been set up as an ethno state, and all of that, right? But I think what the controversy revealed, which is whatever I guess is obvious a priori anyway, is that you could object to those things from different perspectives, right? That not all, not everybody is objected in the same way, right? So
I mean, I think this is especially kind of obvious with Palestine because a lot of people who support Palestine aren't leftists, and some of them have, very kind of reactionary politics. And even the people who don't, who are leftists, have to coexist with these other people. I think this leads to, lots of policy proposals around Palestine not ending up seeming very appealing, apart from the most generic things of like a ceasefire.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, this is like an analogy I was thinking about the other day is, okay, if you call yourself an anti-Zionist, that could mean a couple of very different things. The same way that, if the Cold War was going on and somebody called themselves an anti-communist, well, it could be that they were just like a liberal, right? That they were just like a sort of generally pro-capitalist liberal Democrat, or it could be that they were some sort of far right Eastern European nationalist, or even fascist, right? Like that this is what you're anti doesn't by itself tell us much of anything about what you're for. And similarly, I think you can be an anti-Zionist from very different directions, right? Like, depending on whether it's like, look, do you have an objection to nationalisms in general or just to this one, right? Do you
Right.
like, is there do you have do you think that there's something sort of fundamentally obscene about having people have different rights depending on their ethnicity, or do you just have different choices about which ethnicities you like and which ones you don't like, etc., right? So I think that's a lot of what sort of came out in it. And I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, because I think that there's, as with a lot of internet controversies of this kind, I think that there are probably a few different kinds of people getting mad at the same time. And some of them don't entirely know what they're mad about. Some of them are sort of bouncing off each other's energy. You get this amazing phenomenon where some people in the same set of replies or quote tweets will say, look, nobody is saying X. And then, like, away, somebody is saying X, right? X, damn it. So
Ex Chad face.
yeah, exactly. X is super based. If you don't believe X, you might as well be a Zionist, so I see a lot of that, right? And it's yeah. So I think that's so yeah. I think there are a few different things going on, and I think that there's also a certain amount of telephone gaming, right? In other words, if one person gets mad at something because they interpret it in a certain way, and somebody else sees that person get mad, then even if they bother to do the thing that people most people don't do, right? The same way that in a statistical sense, the overwhelming majority of humans who've ever lived basically farmers. Statistically speaking, nobody reads articles, but even people who do read
Right. I
articles,
mean, I assume it's kind of 90% didn't read, and then 10% who did read the article read the first paragraph,
yeah,
approximately.
yeah, exactly. Like, there's a lot of that, and people who do read will often sort of read through the lens of controversy they've already seen. And
I mean,
whenever
I got into I was in Ben's Twitter replies recently. I was tempted. I mean, I don't usually post on Twitter at all. But in the
uh,
last couple of days, I was sufficiently annoyed at some people that I was replying on Twitter, and it was this thing of people just being like, when it comes to their like neat little issues, the most kind of basic features of arguments just become impossible to understand. Apparently, like people were
yeah,
like, What point could there possibly be making a comparison between living as a Jew in America and living as a Jew in Israel? Like, how could that establish anything at all? It's like, come on, man. Like, I'm sure you understand the point of making a comparison.
Yeah, yeah. So in that case, that's an instance of Zionists getting mad, and in context. So I should also say I wrote something for Jacobin that came out today. That's uh, that's that's about that's like mostly directed against Zionist arguments, but is also in a certain way a follow up to this dispute, right? Because it's about the sort of argument that you can ground right of return in sort of absolutely universal human rights claims without sort of getting into national particularism or any of this stuff. But yeah, I kind of previewed it in something I said a couple days ago on Twitter, and that led to I think if I understand correctly, there's definitely some context that I'm missing here, but if I believe that one, the people who've been fighting with me on Twitter the last few days, I think that some of those are from this sort of like pro-Israel like leftists in Germany.
Right. I was
I
going to
think,
say that they're unfortunately German, unfortunately for them and unfortunately for us.
yeah. Um, and yeah, there's this whole thing where I'm not gonna, look, holding back from doing national essentialism is going to be much harder for this one than it usually is for in other cases, but I'll do my best. A certain, a
It's actually
certain,
it's fine to generalize German Gentiles because they did the Holocaust. That's like the one last thing that you can do about it.
yeah, this is the last, yes, this is the one acceptable form of essentialism. Yeah, the problem is that I think that there is a certain current, certain depressingly popular current of German thought that sort of draws exactly the wrong record lesson from Germany's like it's like, yes, you should feel guilty about that, you should feel bad, the Holocaust was very bad, but like but they sort of draw the wrong conclusion from it. It's like, okay, so we did genocide against the wrong group, right? That's like, now you know we should just like make sure our like ethno-national allegiances are set up the right way, and and we'll just support like anybody claiming to speak for that group, even if they're engaged in genocidal war crimes against somebody else, which strikes me as not quite getting to the nub of the issue. That's like, yeah, you haven't quite gotten why this was so bad, right? Like, this is the as far as you're grappling with the Nazi past, I think you haven't quite gotten to the sort of
I
core thing that
mean,
was bad about that.
anti-Deutsch has always been a recapitulation of like German exceptionalism. It's just
Right.
flipped around.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, in that argument there was, so I'd said the thing about how, about the right of return. They'd gotten all mad about it. We'd gone back and forth a bunch of times, and I had posted the screenshot from the talk I gave last week for Detroit DSA about debunking pro-Israel talking points, and and I made the point that's like this sort of idea that you need, that like Israel is justified by Jewish safety. That this is essentially the argument that a lot of these guys make, well, the experience, the sort of bitter experience of anti-Semitism in the diaspora leading up to the Holocaust, shows that the Jews can't be safe, if they're living as a minority within other people's societies. You need
They
this
need to live
Jewish
in a
society.
majority country where the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust happens.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, right? Because it's like the point I was making in the screenshot is, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, just like putting aside like morality or like anybody else's safety, right? The safety of those millions of people who've been dispossessed in the last couple several months in Gaza. The shockingly high percentage of Gazan children who are going through malnutrition right now. So putting aside all that, and let's just pretend for the sake of argument that all we care about is the old timey way to say this is like, is it good for the Jews, right? Okay, well, where is it safer to be Jewish? In the Jewish ethno-state or in, for example, the United States, right? Like, pretty much nobody dies for being Jewish in the United States. I mean, hate crimes exist, but that is a vanishingly unusual, rare, extraordinarily unusual way to die. Whereas you're much more likely to die for your group membership in the context of a ethno-state that discriminates against, oppresses, commits violence against other groups, because doing those things tends to create a cycle of attacks and counterattacks and atrocities and counter-atrocities. So it just seems to me that even if all we cared about, the only issue we cared about was Jewish safety, secular multi-ethnic democracy seems like a model that actually preserves that much better than a Jewish ethno-state does. So that was my point, and there was a lot of playing dumb about that in various bizarre ways, but yeah. So, and I saw, by the way, Janos, I think in the chat a while back said something about Lilian Sekerchia's critique of the original article, which I actually do address in the essay we were talking about today, and we can certainly talk about it more today. But yeah, there's a sort of spectrum of objections to the article. But just for anybody who's feeling lost right now, just like really quickly, like I think I've basically already said it, but really quickly, the basic point of the original article was just that there's a Zionist argument that I've been seeing a lot lately that is, actually, Zionism, because Jews are like the original native population of Israel-Palestine from thousands of years ago, who were, dispersed, by foreign oppressors, then therefore, Zionism, sort of influx of Jews back there, the creation of a Jewish state, is a sort of long delayed act of, decolonialization or something like that. And, which, is a really hilarious reversal, by the way, given the history of Zionist rhetoric on this. Like, all the early Zionists talked in exactly the opposite way about how they felt about colonialism and all that. But, put that aside. This is an argument that I see a lot, and there are basically two ways you can respond to it. I mean, maybe there are more, but there are at least two obvious ways. One is you can say, no, that's wrong, because there's a kind of statute of limitations on indigeneity, so too much time has passed, therefore Jews are no longer, the original, people, the First Nations, whatever. In this case, Judea and Samaria aren't the First Nations anymore. Really, it's Palestinian Arabs who become the native population. And so that's one way of pushing back against this argument. The other way of pushing back against this argument is just to say, why do I care who's original, right? What does that have to do with anything? And that's what I very strongly argued for there. And a lot of the point I'm making here is, I've basically...
They mix their labor with the land, Ben.
Yeah, exactly. It gets so Lockean so quickly when you start to actually dig into why this is supposed to matter. And, basically the shape of the article is one that's been in my head for a very long time. That wasn't originally going to be tied to Israel-Palestine at all. That what I originally had in mind was in some ways a much crankier article that I would have had to publish somewhere other than Jacobin, because there's no way they would have gone for this, which would have been called something like "Why Land Acknowledgements Are Reactionary Nonsense." And
I mean, more like the title I gave to TIR and then you changed on GTAA.
Yeah. For GTA, well, look, I figure the highbrow title where we're like referencing all the philosophers we're talking about,
it's good.
I figured that would go well for GTA. I think the TIR title is fine. It's also, it's also an appropriate title, but like, You'll notice I did not change it there. I do have access to the back end there too, so I left it be. But um, but yeah, that like this idea that's like, oh, this is the land of this group, as if there is if like an entire ethnic group had some sort of genetic connection to a given piece of land. I think is just crazily reactionary, right? That this is, I mean, one, it's always historically illiterate because pieces of land are always changing hands, right? Before
Yeah, I mean,
to take,
how far does your blood run? Does it go to the Golan Heights? Like,
yeah, I mean, and there's yeah, I mean, like
why does it stop at the Jordan River?
yeah, totally, right. And like, what's and like, yeah, like the example I used in the article was about like this insane right wing congresswoman from upstate New York who wants to get all government documents to refer to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria. And I pointed out she doesn't seem to be troubled by the fact that not that many centuries ago, her district was the Iroquois Confederacy. But like, look, I mean, the Iroquois Confederacy isn't even that old, right? I mean, it was something else before that. It was something else before that. So that's one issue. But also, it's just like it just doesn't matter, right? I mean, this is what drove me crazy. Um, when I was reading Naomi Klein's new book, Doppelganger, which I actually overall I liked it. I thought it was a good book, but I definitely have some nitpicks. And one of the things that really drove me crazy in there is that there's a section where she talks about the protests after the discovery of evidence of indigenous graves by the residential schools. And she's talking about that whole thing, and she has this line that's like kind of the ultimate Canadian liberal line, where she's like, we settlers like me need to do a better job of being good guests and neighbors on this land. Okay, well, hold up. If
She's probably like fourth generation or something.
If that, right? Like, this is like, there's no way that Naomi Klein's family were like settling Canada in the 1700s, but
they're probably expelled from the US after the Revolutionary War.
I mean, I don't even think that's true in her case, right? I mean, but that's like, I think that she's I mean, I would actually be pretty shocked if Naomi Klein's family hadn't had showed up any earlier than the late 19th century from like Eastern Europe. But in any case, so it's like, look, a Guatemalan immigrant who took their Canadian immigration test last week, if somebody said, oh, they're not like really a fully signed up member of their society, they're just like a guest, right? Yeah. Naomi Klein would presumably think that person was a fascist. But
yeah, like, like insanely racist.
Yeah, it's like, well, hold on. So you were born in Canada, but because your ancestors belong to the wrong ethnic group, right? Therefore, you're a guest. Which, by the way, like, look, if you really believe that, I mean, why isn't Naomi Klein a Zionist? Because by her own admission, right, like by her own theory, right, Jewish people anywhere in the diaspora aren't really full members of their societies, right? I mean, this it's completely incoherent. So, but no, I mean, so that's the basic point, right? That I think that the sort of grounds for objecting to Zionism should be that nobody's rights should depend on their ancestry, that nobody, what their ethnicity or religion is, where their grandparents live, any of that stuff, right? And I think that, we should just look, I think, go back to the line I've heard you use several times in past streams, right? That like, liberalism is the second best idea anybody ever had, right? This is sort of basic ass 101 liberalism, right? The sort of stated principles of like the declarations of the rights of man and citizen from the French Revolution is, yeah, everybody should have the same package of rights just for being a person. And I think that this is, and so I think that's enough to get you an objection to Zionism. That's enough to get you all the basic Palestinian complaints, about the Nakba in 1948, subsequent denial of readmission to refugees, the discrimination against Israeli Arabs, the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that you can't rule over people for 57 years without giving them citizenship in your state, right? Or 1 year for that matter, right? People have a right to self-government. And, I would say that like socialism is like upgrading that idea by taking more seriously, the idea that, that our right to, that our right to have a democratic say in things that involve us doesn't sort of stop when we enter this room called the economic, right? That's not the sphere.
Right, and it's definitely completely incompatible with any idea of kind of land redistribution based on past claims, because land arrangements in Palestine or anywhere else
Yeah.
in the early 20th century were not very good.
Yeah. So we'll definitely get to this, right? So so that's like the basic point of the original article. And I should say that in the original article, the part that people objected to the most was when like the main point was like pushing back against the Zionist argument I started with, but in passing, I did have a couple of paragraphs on what I called the anti-Zionism of fools, tweaking the August Babel line about anti-Semitism. And I gave a couple of examples, which were, basically just things that I've seen a lot on social media and that have really disturbed me every time I've seen them, which are people who insist on referring to every single Israeli Jew as a settler or a colonizer, without like even people who are like third generation residents of Tel Aviv who've never been near a settlement.
I mean, you see at least, well, probably actually a large percentage, because people intermarry, are descended from old Yishuv.
Yeah, totally, right.
It doesn't matter, but
no, it doesn't. It doesn't matter at all, right? But like it's like even on its own terms, this stuff doesn't really make sense. Or like I gave an example. I think I've actually seen a couple of different iterations of this, and this is actually the one that has always sort of seemed the most gross and racist to me. People who like do these weird things where they'll like dunk on some, Israeli Jew who often, richly deserves being dunked on, for whatever they said, but the way they'll dunk on them is by like pointing at how white they look or the fact they have an Ashkenazi surname and be like, oh yeah, you really seem like you're indigenous to the Middle East.
I mean, have you seen Palestinians?
Yeah.
They're very white.
Yeah. I mean, you can't tell, like at a glance, you can't tell the difference between a Palestinian and an Israeli Jew. That's why they, for the most of the existence of the state of Israel, they forced everybody to carry around ID cards that that said, so, if you were like stopped and questioned, you had to pull it out, that even if you were a citizen, said like Jewish or Arab on them, right? Because how else would you tell? Right, like it's.
I mean, they had the same thing in South Africa, right? Because they had this Baroque system of racial classification, where it wasn't really obvious if you were coloured or black until you pulled out your race card, your actual race card.
right. Play the race card, yeah. No, totally. And it's like, look, this isn't even true on its own terms. The vast majority of Israeli Jews, I mean, the Russian population complicates it a little bit. And like a lot of those people also, the lots and lots of not very Jewish Russian people, ended up,
a lot of them have like big problems in Israel because of like, there's something wrong with their lineage. Because obviously Israel does believe in this stuff that, we're being critical of. They aren't legally Jews, which means they can't get married and stuff.
Yeah, totally. Right. But it's like, putting aside the Russian complication, the vast majority of easily classifiable Jews in Israel are Mizrahi anyway, right? They have that their people didn't live in Europe during the diaspora. They lived in different different places in the Middle East. So even on its own terms, none of this stuff is really true. But it's also just the sort of implication, right? That when you say oh, it doesn't really seem indigenous to the Middle East. It's like, well, I mean, you have it. So you're saying that like somebody's presence is in like a area of the world that they were born in is like less
Oh no, I mean
legitimate.
not where they were born in, where like someone 10K years ago was born in, right?
Yeah, it's like that. That's like less legitimate because of their skin color or how their name sounds to you. This is getting very creepy and not particularly left wing in its valence, right? And so, you know, I took a couple shots at that and just said, look, the point is not like, oh, you know, that you should like root for, you know, that like ethnicities or teams and you should like root for Team Palestine, you know, because like because they have this special quality of being indigenous. It's that all human beings deserve equal rights, and all sorts of things that have been done since the beginning of the Zionist project to Palestinians violate that, and you should stop doing them. Right? That you should you know, give equal rights to everybody and not and no longer make, you know, distinctions, you know, based on you know, race, creed, or color, right? As the sort of, you know, old timey American formulation says. And so that's the point of the article. So there are a few different reasons that, you know, people got mad at it. And actually, in the follow up essay, I know that the accusation is always going to be, oh, I'm just like going after the low hanging fruit or whatever. Trust me, I'm not. There's way lower hanging fruit than anything
If
I
it's
mentioned
low
in this
hanging, there
essay.
was a lot of it. I was eating.
Yeah, there's much lower hanging fruit that I skipped. Right, like I spent days arguing on Twitter with like lunatics who were like who like literally took the position that like every single Israeli Jew should be like removed from the country as a settler. You know,
Justice is when you expel people, and the more people you expel, the more justicey it is.
yeah, the justier it is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that so there really are like, I mean, I always try to remind myself that like who's loud. I mean, you know, this is the least original observation of all time, right? But I mean, it's who's loudest on the internet is not a very good indication of how many people there are who hold a given position in the real world. But like,
And you know, those people probably most of them aren't anti-Semites because they probably have just as an insane view as Europeans with as regarding Europeans in North America.
oh yeah, absolutely. I actually don't think that they're anti-Semites. I just think that
Well,
they're
I
like
think
crazy.
quite a few of them probably are, but
I mean, some of them are anti-Semites, but
yeah,
like I think that a lot of them are not anti-Semites.
yeah,
They're just
they're also insane about other things in the
yeah,
same
like
sort of way.
totally. Like I argued with people who are like who like would bring up things they thought were reductios that were like really disturbing to me. I was like, wait, you think that you think that, right? That's like that like basically like they just took it for granted that like any like French person who lived in Algeria, like, you know, had it come in if they were killed after independence and stuff like that. Like just insane things like that. That like, oh, well, would you say that there should be, you know, equal rights for, you know, for everybody regardless of background in this situation? It's like, yes, obviously. Right. Like this is you know, well, you know, what if Hitler had won the war and then had like, you know, 70 years later gone down or whatever, would you say that there should be, you know, equal rights for ethnically German people in Eastern Europe? It's like, yes, of course, right? This is like, this is not, none of this is hard. In fact, after World War II, Stalin actually did do mass removal of a lot of ethnic Germans, and it was, you know, very bad. Look into it, right? Not good. Um,
Yeah, and I
but
absolutely support the right of all the Russians who live in Latvia and Lithuania and so on to stay where they are, and even to not speak Latvian and Lithuanian and to speak their own language and so on if they so want. It's probably better for
totally,
integrate, but if they don't, then they don't.
yeah, totally, yeah, absolutely, right. This is like again, none of these are hard questions, right? This is you know, this is all very easy, or it should be, right? So so in the follow-up essay in the Substack, the one we're talking about today, I largely ignored like the really lunatic fringe stuff and just talked about what I think were the more at least interesting objections to the original article. So so part of that has to do with the way that, you know, some academics telephone gamed the article into a critique of what they called settler, you know, settler colonial analysis of Israel or Zionism.
Which will probably be Ben publishing next week.
Yes. Yes, there you go. Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, the phrase "settler colonial" never appeared in the article, so it's like I don't know how you're seeing a critique of something I don't even mention. Um, I think that you know, it's like, look, I would have to hear more about what you have in mind to know whether I agreed with it or not. But on the face of it, um, if you want to say like Zionism is a settler colonial project, yeah, I think there are like some pretty obvious senses in which that's true, right? That they have that it's I mean, if colonialism, if you're taking people who come from far away and and coming in and dispossessing people and all that stuff, right? Yeah, sure, that happened, right?
Yeah, I
This
mean,
is
it's the only real ongoing colonial project in the world, which is why kind of trying to push it under the same kind of language where you talk about the United States and Canada, which are finished settler colonial projects, is also not very good.
Yeah, I mean, I actually remember after October 7th, there was this woman who I'm trying to remember her name, but she like mostly posts about pop culture and stuff. And I'd actually kind of liked what I'd seen from her in that capacity, who posted the most insane reaction I saw from anybody, which was like, she was like, well, if like Native Americans did the same thing, right?
Right, that one.
Like, we would have it coming. I would, what'd she say? I would like hide.
I just lay my neck down, they could chop it off.
Yeah, she was like, I would, it would suck, and I would hide like a rat in a hole or something. I'm trying to remember. It was something like this. I'm sure people will
Yeah, I
recognize
mean,
it.
it's especially kind of pathetic that these people don't imagine that they had united with the oppressed or whatever prior to this and done anything for them. Rather, they just imagine that it suddenly happens one day and then they're beheaded.
Yeah.
Like if you're going to fantasize that you're like the good one, like the Poles that were officially legalized as black in Haiti.
Right. Yeah. It's your fantasy. At least make yourself one of the good ones who's spared. Yeah.
Just
No.
put yourself in mental Hamas instead of mental October the 7th victim who thinks it's cool that they did it actually.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, no, it's totally wild. But yeah, it's like, look, I do think that there are some pretty clear senses in which if somebody describes it the way you just did, right, as the world's only ongoing settler colonial project, I would nod along, be like, yeah, I totally see what you mean by that. But in order to see anything I said in my article as even an indirect or implicit critique of settler colonial analysis, you need to think that having a settler colonial analysis of like the sort of larger Zionist project entails, right, not just suggests or gives you a reason to, but actually entails thinking that every single Israeli Jew should be referred to as a settler, because that I did criticize. But why would it entail that? I mean, I think that certainly that's not the way most people use the word settler. Basically, I think other than some academics and some activists, it's not the way anybody in the world uses the word settler. Because what people would say, like the academics who would get mad at me on Twitter, what they would say is, well, by settler, I mean somebody whose structural position puts them at the top of the ethnic hierarchy of a settler colonial project. And I would say, look, that's a linguistic choice you could make, right? But I wouldn't advise it, right? Like this seems like a very inadvisable way of using the word settler to me, because I think that if you want to say that sentence, you can just say that sentence. You don't need to
Right, because
say,
under that you can redefine someone from the old Yishuv into being a settler, but then you're using the word settler for someone that never settled anything.
yeah, not only did
Apart
they
from
not
maybe
settle
like in the
anything,
14th century or something, when
their
then you
ancestors
get into
didn't.
that, it's like, well, why did the Jews have to resettle Jerusalem in the 14th century? It's because they were exterminated by the Crusaders and blah blah blah.
Also, the Jews who moved to Jerusalem in the 14th century weren't moving there as settlers, right? They weren't like
No, not at all.
To put it mildly, right? They didn't
Yeah.
exercise any power over anybody when they got there.
They were at the bottom of a lot of different things.
Yeah, so at that point you're using the word settler to cover people who aren't even descended from settlers, never mind aren't settlers themselves. But even people who are descended from people who you might reasonably refer to as settlers, I think using the word settler that way, right, is strikes me as extremely unhelpful. Because again, it's not that like language just dictates that you use the word that way to be accurate, because what you're actually suggesting is a revision of ordinary language. The ordinary language usage of the word settler is very different from this. So you're suggesting this very counterintuitive revision of ordinary usage of the word. And so it's like language is not forcing this on you. If you're making this choice, you're making this choice. And so now we can
We need
ask.
to abolish prisons, Ben, and the police. By which
Yeah,
I mean we
exactly.
need to change them a bit.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like if so let's examine the merits of this proposed revision of language. Um, I think it's a pretty bad one because because look, obviously it was not always so, but in 2024, if you refer to somebody as a settler, the vast majority of people will hear in that an implication that their presence in the place that they're settling is illegitimate, because that's just what settler, like, I mean, again, this is historical progress. Colonialism has become much less popular, right, which is a good thing. um so if you don't want that, right, if you're one of these people saying, oh, nobody's saying, right, that their presence is illegitimate, nobody's saying that they should be removed, even while 10 people a few comments down are saying it. um Look, if all you mean to indicate when you call them a settler is that they're in the privileged slot, right, in a settler colonial system. If that's all you mean to indicate, and the normative conclusion that you draw isn't that they should be removed, it's just that everybody should be structurally equal, then this seems like an incredibly counterproductive way to use language to me, right? This is a way of using language that's very different from standard ways, that doesn't really have any virtues, that doesn't communicate anything that wouldn't be
And I don't
communicated.
think was used historically. Like I don't think in the
Definitely not.
anti-apartheid struggle people used settler as a framing. I guess people said
Yeah.
white, which you wouldn't want to say Jews now.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, no, people say whites, or I don't know, Boers maybe, right? But like you wouldn't yeah, but you wouldn't say settlers there, right? So it's like, yeah, you're suggesting a novel use of language that's very counterintuitive, and it's very likely to communicate to most listeners something very different from what you tell me that you mean. And so I would just say that the purpose of language is to communicate information, and that you should make linguistic choices that are going to convey what you want to convey and not convey something else, right? That would be my counter argument against that. The more substantive objection, I suppose, is the one that the Jacobin article today also addresses, which is, okay, Ben, you say that all of the sort of standard Palestinian complaints can be made sense of just in terms of, not like national narratives, or, or indigeneity or any of this stuff, but just by appeals in the present tense to universal human rights. Um, and maybe we could see that for the disenfranchisement of Palestinians and the West Bank and Gaza, and the you know ethnic cleansing. I would actually say genocide in the strict legal sense that's going on right now in Gaza, discrimination against Israeli Arabs, etc. But what about the right of return? Surely that one you do have to get into all these issues that you don't think that you need to get into, and I don't think so, right? I think that basically, just to skip ahead a little bit, I think that ethnic cleansing is bad, and that and regardless of which ethnicity it happens to, it's bad, right? If anybody is removed from where they live because of their ethnicity, that is always a bad thing. And whether that ethnicity has been around for 10 years or 10,000 years. And that if anybody is ethnically cleansed from an area, I think the survivors should obviously have a right to come back, right? And that's, and their families should have a right to come back. So this is, I think this is also something that I think fits very neatly into a package of absolutely universal human rights, no claims about indigeneity, needed for that. But then what I would see, and this is where it gets really interesting to me, and this is where we finally get to, where you started us off, right? About farming, that people will say, well, hold on though, Ben. Real right of return wouldn't just mean letting Palestinian refugees like immigrate back to Israel. It would mean land back. That the stuff that they or the families used to own, that they would get back. Now, I think if you're talking about like houses, I mean, if somebody, look, I'm a socialist. I don't believe in a right to private property, the means of production, but I am fine with personal property. If if the courts of a post-Zionist state, like gave somebody their house back, as they prove original ownership or whatever, I have no problem with that. Although I also think that these situations are complicated enough, because if somebody is like, whoever doesn't get the house is being screwed over a little bit and deserves some form of financial compensation. But, but again, I have no problem with somebody getting the house back. But also, I run the numbers a little bit in the essay, and we're not actually talking about very many houses at this point, because one, about 750,000 Palestinians were dispossessed in the Nakba, and there are about 7.5 million Israeli Jews today. Most of them do not live in houses occupied by the first group, especially because
There's also about 8 million Palestinians descended from expellees and others. So, like,
yeah,
either way, it's not going to work.
yeah, and it's and there's a and also, the generally speaking, people in poorer countries, you tend to have more people living in one house than people in richer countries. And Palestine in the 1940s was a much poorer country than Israel today. So that brings the numbers down even lower. It's also the case that in any country in the world, lots of houses that were standing in the 1940s aren't going to be standing anymore. I mean, that just sort of turnover over time. And it's especially going to be true in the case of Israel-Palestine, because a lot of the original ethnic cleansing involved entire villages being razed to the ground, right, rather than the buildings being moved into. So we're actually talking about, I think, a very tiny percentage of current Israeli homes that are sort of in continuous use, formerly Palestinian homes, that are still standing from the 1940s. So in that case, yeah, with that tiny minority of homes, yeah, I mean, again, in cases where somebody gets the house back, I feel happy for them, but like, again, I hope whoever doesn't get it, right? Because there are actually some messy considerations here. Again, I hope at least get some kind of financial compensation, but like, that doesn't really strike me as that big an issue. But then when I said this to people, I would get, oh, no. But what about, why are you just restricting yourself to houses, right? What about just land in general, right? Like, if somebody, if something used to be a Palestinian farm and now it's an Israeli shopping mall, why does the shopping mall get to stay, right? So really what you should be doing is you should just be trying to restore all the property. And there, I think, a little bit of pausing and taking a beat on that, right? I mean, it's like, look, if a libertarian tells me that, then I think, okay, well, that makes sense, right? You're a libertarian. You think libertarian things, right? We have a much bigger disagreement. But
You're
if
going to be
somebody,
very excited for the Palestinians to have shopping malls.
yeah, but if somebody who thinks of themselves as a socialist, or especially a Marxist, says that, then I get very confused, right? Or really just a leftist in general, right? Because I think that, and in the essay, I kind of go through this from a couple of different perspectives, right? One of them is thinking about Marx and, and the section on enclosures from Capital. The other one is thinking about sort of debates in 20th century normative political philosophy between, like, left-leaning philosophers like Rawls and libertarians like Nozick. And I think that either way, I think what you come to is the same basic divide about, okay, how do we think about justice and distribution, right? Like, is what counts as sort of a sort of just set of property arrangements? Is it about like correcting past injustices, trying to go back to whoever has the best claim, right, historically on something? Or is it fundamentally different from that? Is it that like actually it's not a historically oriented way of thinking about justice? It's a present tense oriented way of thinking about it, that we want more equal distribution going forward. So like that, as you were sort of teasing earlier, Marx, so the last section of Capital, which actually in today's essay on philosophy for the people, I have which is just a transcript of a talk I gave in Ann Arbor the week before. But in there, I kind of joke about how if Marx were pitching Capital to like Verso or Sublation or somebody now, they would surely make him put the last section out right at the beginning, because it would grab readers' attention much better than all that stuff about yards of linen. But the last section of Capital is about the enclosures. This is a process that, like, actually, if you read those chapters of Capital, is in certain respects not unlike the Nakba, right? That this is, so I wrote an article for Jacobin.
I mean, it's a very important point about Israel, and that you can make by pointing stuff like that as out, by kind of relating its settling legacy, that there's nothing really special about Israel. And both Zionists and anti-Zionists who probably haven't thought about it too good insist that what Israel is doing and what Israel is special. But I think if you're the good anti-Zionism is insisting that no, what Israel does is so much similar to what various other countries is, and that not only just kind of demystifies it and moves you totally away from anti-Semitism, but also offers solutions, because most of these problems have been solved in other countries, and it's what kind of insisting, talking about Israeli apartheid is why it's such a good political move.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, I think that, that the same way, right. It's not, like you could, in fact, look, you could talk about South Africa in this way where, say, okay, the problem with South Africa is that the white population is a settler population who dispossessed black people in South Africa. And it's like, look, from a certain historical perspective, everything that would all be true, right? Like, that's a thing that happened, right? But the ANC's framing, which I think was correct, was the problem with South Africa is that you have different human beings who have different rights based on totally arbitrary distinctions, and we need to change that. And I think that's the right way to think about Israel also. And yeah, I think that there being massive injustices that are done to people who were once on pieces of land is extremely ununique. Right. This is the history of the world is overflowing with it, which I know is the kind of thing that people who are like, apologists for Israel would say, where like the lesson they would draw from it.
Yeah. I mean, when they're not insisting they're incredibly special, they'll also be like, "Why are you targeting us and not other countries?"
Yeah, which
Like,
was also
I think
which
there's lots of
yeah
people who speak out two sides of their mouths, and maybe this is anti-Semitic, but I feel like Zionists are really the kings of it.
yeah no I absolutely right. I mean, like, or certainly they're the current reigning kings. I mean, and look, I mean, this is not unlike what people used to say all the time, like right wingers would say all the time in like the 1980s about South Africa. It's like, oh my God, there's so many human rights abuses in other nations in Africa. Why are you so focused on this? And in fact, really, if you look at it, black South Africans still have a higher standard of living than, black people do in this country or that country, right? That's like
Right,
it
pointing
was
to Angola and other countries which were fighting South Africa and had
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah,
run
yeah.
the Portuguese off 2 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's I think it's not like even the talking out of the two sides of their mouth is not totally unique, but yes, I think they are the current world rating champs on that. But yeah, no, it's so like their conclusion is, oh, therefore don't worry about it, right? There's lots of injustice, lots of places, so stop talking about it, right? I think rather it's that no, we should, there are general principles that you could use to address this everywhere. And so I wrote so yeah, like even if people who look, if I know it's unlikely but possible that there will have at least one viewer today who has not read all through 33 chapters of Capital. Um, so to that person, that's one, I'm gonna do that class again soon, so you should sign up. But anyway, two, that's I think if you really read those chapters, right? But some of this stuff is really harrowing, right? I mean, this is so I wrote an article for Jacobin last year called "The Duchess of Sutherland and Slavery" that was about one of the examples that Marx uses in those chapters, which is this estate in Scotland that was like this massive estate, this huge number of peasants who were driven off in this like incredibly violent process, right? When basically the then Duchess of Sutherland decided that it would be more profitable to use the land as a sheep pasture, and so even though all these people had centuries and centuries of these feudal land rights, they were driven off. And like actually, I remember thinking when I was reading Marx's description of this, I remember thinking of, if you've ever seen the movie District 9, right? That's kind of the vibe I was getting from the description of what this process of like bringing in like soldiers to like to drive these people off their land. Like there was like one like old woman in the estate who was like burned alive because she wouldn't leave her house, when they set fire to it, stuff like that. So it's like this is this incredibly awful process, right? The majority of the inhabitants of the island where you live were dispossessed in this process without, as Marx says in Capital, a farthing of compensation. But you'll notice that Marx's solution is not, all right, well, let's get those farthings of compensation now, right? Like, well, we'll figure out exactly whose ancestors.
Or move these people back to their island out of the industrial centres and force them to
Yes.
start farming dirt again.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's
right, because I'm sure my ancestors were really violently dispossessed when they were forced out of their peat bog in Ireland. I'll never know because the record office that held these records was burnt down during the Irish War of Independence.
right.
But I don't want it back. I don't want to. I certainly, if I was going to have it back, I'd only use it as a rentier. I'm not going to go back there and use it.
Yeah,
I want to move on to new forms of production and ownership.
Yeah, I mean so there's this gimmicky thing that Lafroig, the whiskey, does, where they every bottle comes with this little piece of paper that says that like it entitles you to like a quarter of an inch or something of the of like the area where the distillery is. And it's like, really, this is just a gimmicky way of putting it. It's really so like you could like, I don't know, fill something out and join the Lafroig club or whatever. But like the joke me and my brother always used to make, because we had drank so much of this stuff over the years, is that like someday we're going to show up in Lafroig with our like wheelbarrow of of papers and claim our land. But in any case,
no,
yeah.
I mean, I think you should get land back from whatever Eastern European place your family was forced out of.
Well, right now, that is maybe not the most desirable land because there are Russian and Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting. So I might wait on that. But
I've got a friend who's half Chinese, half Jewish, and his family is from Lov in Western Ukraine. It's like, oh wow, there's still Nazis there now.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of retired this joke when the war started because I felt bad about it. But for the longest time, when there was just a saber rattling, my standard line about it was, people ask me what my position is on on the situation in the Ukraine, and my position is that if they wanted me to use that if they wanted me not to use that definite article, they should have been nicer to my family. But yeah, I think that so Marx's solution is very much not that, right? I mean, like in fact, I also use this in the talk in Ann Arbor to illustrate what Engels means in Anti-Düring, when he says, he gives his like sort of three principles of like dialectical analysis, and one of them is the negation of the negation. Say, okay, what do you mean by the negation of the negation? And it's like, yeah, I think this is a perfect example, right? That this is the unlike like a literal negation, like of a statement, right, where the negation of the negation just takes you back to the original statement. The so when Marx is thinking of negating, right, the original act of negation of these people's property rights, right, it's not to take you back to where you started, right? It's so he says essentially the revolutionary conclusion of capital. There's another chapter after it, which is also an odd structural choice, but whatever. But at the end of like chapter 32, right, he's just finished going through this whole incredibly gruesome centuries-long process of dispossession, and he says essentially, look, there's no turning back the clock, right, to this earlier mode of production. Can't happen, wouldn't want it to happen, whatever, right? This is but what it does is it lays the groundwork for the expropriation of the expropriators. And he expresses the hope that this could be done much more quickly and peacefully, because rather than a few people expropriating the vast majority, it's the vast majority expropriating a few people, right? So, but you're not turning the clock back to some earlier division of property. You're turning it forward to something new and better, more egalitarian and desirable and democratic. And similarly, I think if you look at the debate, the Rawls Nozick debate in the late 20th century, I think you find similar fault lines that that Rawls has this like roughly egalitarian theory of justice. There are caveats and criticisms you can make from the left and all this stuff that we've talked about many times before. I'm not going to get into any of that now, right? But it's like all that matters for our purposes right now is that Rawls has a roughly egalitarian view about justice. And Nozick has this famous criticism of Rawls, which is also, he takes as a sort of general, like Nozick is very impressed with himself. He thinks that this is a sort of generally applicable, devastating criticism of any theory of justice, according to which justice is about how resources are distributed in the present tense, where he says, well, look, assume that your preferred distribution of resources was enacted, right? That like, so everybody had exactly what you think it would be just for them to have. And now let's assume that that everybody's making their own choices about how to spend their money, and you could
If
if
I
you
can
think
manage their peat bog, I'm sure it'd go very badly for me.
and so this is and so he says, and this dates the example, but he talks about Wilt Chamberlain, the basketball player, very popular. If you believe his numbers, extremely popular among the opposite sex, but they have he made a famous claim once that he'd slept with like 11,000 women or something crazy like that. I don't remember what the actual number was, but it was like whatever it was something that like you have to like pause and do the math on it, right? It's like, wait.
Yeah, like three a day for 10 years, whatever,
Yeah. But in any case, so it says, okay, what if basically Wilt Chamberlain, asked for like people to like voluntarily tip him, basically, when they come see him play basketball. So many people do it that before Wilt Chamberlain's, the richest guy in the world. Nozick has this snide little thing. Look, it's according to you, this is the money they should have had. They could have spent it on subscriptions to Dissent magazine. Surely, if Nozick were writing it now, he would have said Jacobin as the little jab, right? At socialists. But they choose to spend it on this. So now, according to you, everybody had as much as they should have had to spend how they like. So clearly there's no injustice in this process, right? Because who is an injustice being done to? Certainly not Chamberlain, certainly not the people who voluntarily gave their money that you thought they should have had to do this. So there's no injustice. So if your theory of justice is right, then there is an injustice, because clearly your theory of justice doesn't dictate that Wilt Chamberlain's supposed to be the richest man in the world, but also it makes no sense on your own terms for this to be unjust. Therefore, uh, therefore, any sort of pattern based theory of justice is wrong. That like really justice isn't about what pattern of distribution you end up with; it's about how you get there. Now, I think for a
It's a really
variety,
good argument if you don't notice you've been tricked.
yeah, exactly. Uh, I mean, I think it's sort of a superficially, I think it's a sort of superficially clever argument. I think there's actually a place where Gia Cohen says, like quoting, like tweaking the classic Kant line about Hume, that sort of thinking about Nozick's work, awoke him from his dogmatic socialist slumber and, made him, basically work much harder to defend his views. But I think ultimately it's just a really bad argument, because what's essentially happened here is that we've and yeah, No Name says Nozick's hypotheticals are painfully disconnected from any interest in reality. Yeah, look, I mean, I don't have a problem with using hypothetical examples to like test principles, right? Clearly, but
Ben's a mythic philosopher, so don't disrespect him.
yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. No, that's very offensive to us. No, that's like I
My
don't have a problem.
hypotheticals aren't useless.
Look, you sprinkle the trail of people seeds over the trolley track. Yeah. Then the train hits the time machine, and yeah, no, it's look, I love hypotheticals, but I think that the and I'm not, and I actually do think, all joking aside, the hypotheticals are often like a useful way to test consistency, right? It's like, oh, what would I say in that situation? And that tells you something about the principles that you're working from and whether they fit together logically and all this stuff. So I don't necessarily have a problem with that, in itself, but I think that as you say, this is, the way you said it just now is just right. This is a very good argument until you realize you've been tricked. That essentially in a disguised form, the conclusion is being smuggled into the premises. That because Nozick is assuming that in order to be an unjust outcome, an injustice must have been done to someone, right? Which is just assuming the process-based view of justice rather than the outcome-based view, which is actually the issue that's in dispute, right? I mean,
There doesn't seem to be any kind of argument against someone going, well, if justice isn't anything to do with outcomes, as in there can be any possible outcome and that can be just,
yeah,
then you seem to have a right to say, well, I don't really care about justice then.
yeah, right. What I care about is schmustus, which is about outcomes. Yeah. Yeah, that seems totally right. Like, again, I think that I think that on reflection, no, actually, I do care quite a bit about outcomes. And by the way, when you say, oh, so liberty disrupts patterns, in other words, that, you can only sort of continually enforce a pattern over time if you're engaged in acts of redistribution. It's like, okay, but like, look, even just like normal liberal capitalist countries do redistribution all the time. I mean, this is, in my country, it's April 15th, right? Once a year, right? We do redistribution, and I think as and it's like this is not the point. Is just like, would it be unjust to just let this stay in place as opposed to doing some sort of redistribution? And and I think that the idea that it's process based, right, is actually, I think what people are doing is essentially that they're unwittingly siding with the sort of Nozickian view in the normative debate, or the sort of views that Marx is implicitly contesting against, that sort of long for some kind of return to some hazy pre-capitalist idol, right? I don't know, J.R.R. Tolkien, right? That's the sort of thing that's being expressed there.
Native Americans own 99.9% of the land in the United States, and all the white people live in massive hab blocks on the coast.
um, like that's like, yeah,
And the natives are just doing capitalism and the rest.
yeah,
That's socialism.
exactly. It's like, yeah, look, there's a sort of fundamental dividing line between libertarian and leftist views of justice, which is justice about sort of process and who has the best historically based claim to some piece of property, or is justice about creating a more equal, a better society going forward. And and I think that the subject of land back, right? Whether we're talking about Israel or the U.S. or Canada or whatever, right? Or I mean, as far as I know, nobody advocates you know, reverse engineering from the enclosures and and restoring everybody to their little peasant plots of land.
But it would mean, if taken seriously, well, I don't know, it'll
Yeah,
vary based on what they say, but won't lots of those white people have to come back here? We don't want them. They're going to be, and especially if we were going to do land back from the bloody
yeah,
enclosures, they'd be taking half of it and they can fuck off.
yeah, yeah. It's a whole thing. And I think that so I promised earlier that I would touch on Lillian's critique and Jacobin, which again I do in the article, and I'll do again for just a minute here. I think basically there are two components to it. One I've already addressed, right, which is that she objects to my objection to the word settler, because she thinks that if you have a settler colonial analysis, you should use settler in that structural way. If you don't remember that, just go back to earlier in the video. We did a whole thing about that. So that's one. And then the other one is, well, yeah, one and a half maybe, is she thinks she does seem to suggest at several points that you need to have this sort of historically based view to get right of return. Again, I don't think so. I think a very clear way of seeing that is to ask yourself a very simple question. Here, let's go to a hypothetical. I just said I loved hypotheticals. Imagine that. Look, I mean, there's a lot of like gross Zionist propaganda that makes a big deal of the idea that like some or maybe even all Palestinians really hadn't been living in Palestine for that long, that like really a lot of people might have been recent arrivals from other Arab countries or whatever. I think the vast majority of those claims are probably nonsense, but like pretend they
Not
weren't.
true, and I don't care.
Yeah, not true, but I also don't care, right? But pretend they were true, right? Pretend for the sake of argument that in fact the first like Arab family in Palestine had arrived 6 months before the first Zionist settlers showed up in the 1870s. Hell, pretend they showed up 6 months after the first Zionist settlers showed up in the 1870s. But stipulate that everything else plays out in exactly the same way from that point onward. So like, take like Rashid Khalidi's book, The 100 Years War Against Palestine, just throw in that 100 years into this timeline, right? So from the 1870s to the present, everything plays out in exactly the same way. So there's no indigeneity here, right? Everybody showed up about the same time. But again, everything else plays out the same way. That there's the that the Nakba happens in 1948. There's subsequent denial of right of return. Israel is set up as a structurally discriminatory ethno state. There's the extremely long-term occupation and essentially apartheid in the West Bank. There's the current genocide level crimes in Gaza. All of it's the same. Okay, in that world, would the right of return for refugees matter any less to you than it does in this world? Certainly wouldn't matter any less to me. And I've got to say, over the course of weeks of people getting mad about my article, I've asked this question to many people and pretty much everybody has dodged it, right? Like nobody has just given a straight answer to it. I got one guy, there's history takes or something. Anyway, I don't remember exactly, but it's like it has the word history in it. There's a guy Twitter account
I
that
feel like there's like a negative relation to having history in your Twitter title and in actually having anything useful to say about history.
yeah.
So
So this
also, this all tweets which start with like "I'm an ex academic."
oh my god, or better yet, ex academic here, right? Like it's like
I actually have a PhD in why it's fine for Israel to blow up babies. You just don't understand unless you also have a PhD in urban blowing up baby warfare.
urban playing up babies warfare. Yeah, yeah. No, it's the most annoying thing. It's like oh, I notice people making some claims. Sociologist here. It's like, do you really think that there's some big group of people who are going to be like, oh shit, never mind. All right, I didn't realize that I was in the presence of one of my betters. I now defer.
I'm really looking forward to by the end of this year being able to say like I'm officially a scientist, and all my philosophy takes you have to take seriously as if they were like empirically proven because I'm a scientist.
Absolutely. Yeah. But anyway, so there was this account who got really mad at the article, and I asked him this question like a bunch of times in different ways over the course of him going back and forth, getting mad about it. Like I sea lion the shit out of it, and eventually he said, "Well, it would be less salient in that timeline." It's like, okay, I'm not totally sure what that means. I'm not totally sure you know what that means, but
No,
to the
I mean,
extent,
it seems obvious what it means to me.
I
Like
mean,
it's just less important, and that's a shit take.
yeah, like if you would care about it less, then that's a terrible reactionary take, right? It's like what why is that like if we decided like if some like right-wing racist government came to power um in I don't know, Britain tomorrow, right? And they decided that I don't know, pick an immigrant group in Britain.
Pakistanis.
Pakistanis. They decided that there are too many Pakistanis in Britain, and so um, there any Pakistani, even if they're a British citizen, who came over within the last say 30 years, will have their citizenship stripped from them, and they'll be deported from the country. All right, I would say this would be very bad, and any Pakistani families who were removed from the country when that happened would obviously should have a right to come back, right? Like this is it's not, I mean there's
Right. I
no
mean, if you ask almost all kind of pro-Palestinian people if a Guatemalan has a right to come to the United States to try and make a living, they would say yes. If you asked about a Senegalese person who has no connection to the United States and who the colonial process in Senegal had very little to do with the United States has a right to come to the United States to live and work, they would say yes.
yes, of
So
course.
it
For sure.
seems it seems unnecessary to have this whole baroque justification for why Palestinians have a right to live in Israel, as if you wouldn't just think that anyway.
Totally. Right. It's like, look, I think that there's I mean, honestly, I think that anything short of completely open borders, like everybody who just wants to peacefully move around from one country to another is allowed to do it, is a little hard to justify. That they, since, it's like just accident of birth, right? There's restrictions on your movement. I'm open to hearing like if you think it's impractical, you think that there are like other values that have to be weighed against strict justice, whatever, fine, right? But it's like I think that the sort of baseline should be that any immigration restrictions should be presumed guilty,
Right, I mean, there has to
right?
be restrictions on immigration because you can only build houses and such so
Yeah,
fast and
sure.
blah 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 blah. But these are all
I,
practical concerns, right?
I think that there's like I think that like yeah, so I think that this is like saying okay, like you might say, well, there's like there should be like a speed limit, right? You can only admit so many people at a time or whatever, but just because those practical considerations. So it's like um, it's like a compromise between strict justice and sort of pragmatic, considerations, and fair enough, right? But yeah, I think generally speaking, we should start out being finding immigration restrictions somewhat suspect, and by far the worst, most odious justification for any immigration restriction is, oh, then it would lead to the wrong kind of, ethnic or racial religious, group being here, right? Like that's like the most unacceptable form of, like the, oh, you can't have too many of those people because then the country wouldn't be majority white anymore, right? Like that's like the most unacceptable justification. That should be the justification for an immigration restriction we should have the absolute least time for. But of course, that's the only reason that's given for opposing the right of return is the demographic concerns. So, yeah,
Well,
I
just
think,
like not demographic concerns, but just immediate racist. If we let them in, they'll blow us all up.
yeah. Which, yeah, is, and then, right. It's, so like, I think that but like they will very openly talk about demographic concerns like, oh, obviously you can't do that because then, then if, you had the wrong ethnic composition, then Israel wouldn't be a Jewish state anymore. Um, this is the sort of thing people say all the time. It's like, yeah,
I mean,
obviously I
with
don't.
those, I mean, it's almost the same thing as before with the liberals and immigration, with the kind of pro-Zionist liberals in Germany who are like, well, then Jews will become like a minority in Israel or Palestine or
Yeah,
whatever. And it's like, well, presumably you think it's fine to live as a minority in Germany, but apparently you think it's an absolute horror if you live as a minority in
yeah,
Palestine.
no, yeah, exactly. It's completely incoherent, and it's also like, honestly, also, I mean, if you just gave equal citizenship, I don't care what you call the country, but it's like if you just gave equal citizenship to everybody who lives in Israel Palestine right now, um, then you'd have like approximately equal numbers of Jewish and Arab
Yeah, it is
citizens.
quite neat that it is basically 50-50.
Yeah, so which actually strikes me as the situation that's like the least likely to devolve into to like sort of clear oppression of one group by the other.
No,
But
it would be a shithole like Lebanon.
yeah, well, I have better a democratic shithole than than what you have now. But yeah, I think that so yeah, I don't think you need indigeneity to make sense of a right of return. I think that ethnic cleansing is bad. If it happens to you, you should obviously be allowed to come back. Then is and even people who are a few generations removed. I mean, if you have roots in a place, then then like that should surely give you like some sort of like that makes it like that much worse to deny you from coming there, especially for openly racist reasons. So yeah, that's the second thing. And then the last point that Lillian, who, I think is, obviously, obviously I have disagreements with this about this. I think in this case, I think that she is leaning too much towards like certain academic trends and how people think about this stuff that aren't helpful, but is generally somebody I like and agree with on most things. But like in the last thing I think that the point she made that we haven't really covered is that she said, and by the way, guys, as a general rule, I'm just going to vague scold the chat here. The like if you say, oh, well, what about this scholar who says this thing, and and he's like combining Marxism and socialism with this or that annoying academic thing that you don't like. It's like maybe whatever book you're referring me to will be the exception, but my ingrained training at this point, having heard so much of this shit over the years, is to think, yeah, it's probably some rad lib academic who's trying to have it both ways
I
about
mean,
a lot
my,
of.
my, my general school of chat is that people are being like, well, you say all this, Ben, but you don't believe in land reform in Israel-Palestine. It's like, of course he believes in land reform in Israel-Palestine. Like, and he's
Yeah,
like, oh, people are like, you say all this stuff, but you don't believe in a Palestinian state. And it's like, well, I mean, in the absence of a binational state, obviously he believes in a Palestinian state. Like, they're
yeah,
all
I
just
think,
tilting at windmills.
yeah, I think that my preferred solution would be a binational state with equal rights for everybody and right of return for refugees. And by the way, if we're in preferred solution land, right? Like we're just bracketing, the pragmatic concerns for a moment. I would like extreme land reform there. I would like all the land to be nationalized,
Yeah,
right?
and the states would be abolished entirely. One or two of them, or however many they get there. We'll get rid of them all.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess you might as well throw in the withering away of the state while we're at it. So that eventually gets you to a no state solution. But yeah, look, I think that even if we're still going to have states, right? Yeah, I'd like a
Like, I think, I don't know, I don't want to be rude to this person if it wasn't them, and there's been lots of people chatting, I've also been doing this. But I think that this person was mad at you earlier. And what this person is suggesting here now is just what you believe in. So, like, I don't.
yeah, no, exactly. Like that's, and I think that there's yeah, I would like a binational state with right of return for refugees. Again, I don't think that whether we're talking about the enclosures or we're talking about Israel-Palestine, or we're talking about just the sort of daily injustices of how housing works under capitalism and real estate markets and all that stuff that have people have like somebody's house was taken away by the government so some rich asshole could build a private sports stadium, or they just prices rose and they tried to form a tenants union and it got broken and they eventually lost it, whatever. Like, I think in all these cases, I think that our sort of general emphasis should not be on trying to restore some past division of property. Because for one thing, whatever past division of property you're trying to restore will itself be wildly inegalitarian, right? I mean, Palestine was not a socialist country in the 1940s, right? This is if you're,
Yeah,
especially
I mean, 18th century Britain was definitely not either.
yeah, exactly. Or like people have, or especially if you want to say, well, a lot of the early Zionist projects before 1947 involved sort of low-key dispossession, where basically people would oftentimes find absentee landowners whose own claims to the land were pretty dubious and like buy land from them and then like kick off a bunch of Palestinians who live there. If
Yeah.
that's also bad, right? And which surely you should say that's also bad. That's like, okay, are you trying to restore the property divisions of like late Ottoman Palestine? Was that when we achieved justice?
Though I think people living in the former USSR, if they did land back to 100 years ago, that could be all right.
Yeah, I mean it's yeah, right, just 100 years, yeah. That's like it's I think that in any country, right, again, like, yeah, the form of land reform that I support is nationalize it all, right? Like I don't want to restore the property divisions of some past phase of history, even though there have continuously been injustices over the course of history everywhere, right? I mean, this is the all hitherto existing history is the history of class struggle, right? Like there's this uh like all of history is a parade of injustices, but I don't want to restore some past division of property. I want to go forward to a better one. So, and this brings us to the other point that Lillian makes in her article, which is, I mean, she does actually use the phrase "land back" at one point, but I don't want to straw man her point here, right? Like I said, like her, uh, and yeah, I wasn't laughing at that. I was laughing at the comment that's highlighted. It's ours. We want it fair and square. That's yeah, gotta have, which by the way, I absolutely love it when like right wingers who, uh, sort of go from being moralistic prigs about everything else to being just like nihilistically amoral about stuff like this. It's like, well, we won. So, that makes it okay. Uh,
In 2020, after Biden won the election, you know those posters that have you seen one of those fascist posters where it's like "not stolen, conquered"?
Jesus Christ.
After Biden stole the election in 2020, I just made one of those like on his using his campaign stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. But yeah, but like, sorry, I was going to say, right. So I don't want to straw man her point. I actually think, there's a lot of underlying agreement despite stuff we disagree about, but But she said at one point, and this is the part I addressed directly in the piece, she said that we look, in the course of making this argument that, we actually should be focusing on rectifying past injustices. She said, well, we wouldn't want Palestinian refugees to return just to be like kind of siloed into the ghettos that Israeli Arabs live in. And what I would say about that is that this is actually really interesting, because at this point, the shape of the discussion is essentially what this takes us to is the shape of the intra left, let's say, debate about how to think about racial justice in the United States, right? That this is that basically the situation we've been in, more or less, there's a lot of cleaning up loose ends, but more or less since the successful conclusion of the civil rights movement and the achievement of legal equality, we're in this situation where, okay, legally, black people and white people in the United States have all the same rights, but there are all these disparities, right? That there are, you sort of go through all of the bad and undesirable things that, living in worse housing, having less access to education, all this stuff. It's like there are more black people than white people who live in those conditions, which is pretty obviously causally downstream of Jim Crow. True. But then the interesting political debate is, okay, well, what do you want to do about it? Right? Like
right,
now that
because, land back, taken at least in a not very thoughtful way, well, what happens to all the Palestinians who descended from landless peasants?
Right. yeah, absolutely.
Landless
Right.
descended from aristocrats.
Yeah, which is going to be most of them, because the vast majority of people in any traditional agricultural society are going to be landless. Yeah, totally. Right. So it's like, yeah. So the disparities are very real, and they very clearly are caused by Jim Crow, etc. But then you have this division about what do you do about it, that some of which is strategic, and Janos, that is exactly my point, right? You have summed up. I don't know if you think you're agreeing with me or you think you're disagreeing with me.
No, Janice is a Ben Stan. He's been bravely defending you.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Hail Janos. They have but yeah, exactly. Right. Basic bourgeois democratic principles, right of return makes moral and political sense. Absolutely. So this is, so yeah, you've got, so the disparities are real. The fact that the disparities are downstream of Jim Crow is, I would say, undeniable. You will, of course, find people who deny it because,
it's actually because black people are stupid and they mismanage their money then and they spend it on sneakers.
That is essentially the Charles Murray position, as I understand it. But yes, that's
they wear their sneakers on the sidewalks.
Yes, exactly. So there are people who deny it, but I would otherwise say it's undeniable that the disparities are downstream of the history of racial discrimination. But then the question is, well, what's the goal? Like, what are we trying to achieve? / how are we going to achieve it? And so one approach is to say that we want some sort of racially targeted solution to this problem, up to or maybe including like cash reparations. And, there are lots of different forms that this general family of approaches can take. But this is a very, very popular view, that this is actually, this is like, oh God, I'm trying to remember. The 1619 Project woman was in the New York Times.
This guy that I included for my PhD, he's a libertarian who wrote this book about Jim Crow housing stuff, and his quite silly policy was for the state, the federal government, to buy houses that African Americans were excluded from in the 1950s at 1950 values. Well, buy them at market value, then sell them to African Americans at 1950s value.
Awesome. I think and So I think thinking about solutions like that really makes the divide clear, because again, what's the goal? What's the sort of endpoint of all of this? Because yes, obviously Lillian is right. We would not want returning Palestinian refugees to be siloed into ghettos inhabited by Israeli Arabs. But surely, and I'm not saying she would disagree with this. I'm saying I would urge her to think about it in these terms, right? Which might sort of lead her to think that there's less disagreement than she thinks. That surely we don't want anybody to live in substandard or de facto segregated housing. Um, and like in the case of racial justice in the United States, um, is the goal to get the demographically correct proportions of every racial group living in poverty and having substandard housing and bad education and the
You need
demographically correct?
1.2% of Palestinians to be aristocrats. That is justice.
Yeah, exactly. That you want to have the right percentage of statistically correct number of black and brown people on the board of directors of Lockheed Martin. That this is this it, right? Or do we not want anybody to be living in poverty? Because just as a human being, you shouldn't be able to, right? I mean, so it's like in the case that you were just giving me, the libertarian academic with his
That was
housing.
Rothstein who wrote The Color of Law.
Okay, yeah, uh, yeah. Okay, well, look, Color of Law guy, like, it's
Interviewed on TIR in the distance past.
okay. All right. So one thing to notice about this is, hold on, what if you live in equally bad housing now, but it's not because your grandparents were racially excluded from housing markets in the 1950s, right? Like lots of people, in fact, the majority of people who are living in poverty, have bad housing, etc., don't have a backstory like that, right? The fact that
Right,
black people,
lots of them were just sharecroppers who were just sharecroppers.
right? Yeah, right, exactly, right. So it's like, uh, and this is, I think, where the rubber really meets the road. Is there like a morally innocent form of poverty that's like, oh well, if you're if if the chain of causation that led you to being in poverty didn't involve any racial discrimination or similar injustices, it was just the normal ass day-to-day operation of capitalist property rights doing their thing, then is it then okay that you live in poverty? Um, and I know that a lot of times people who think of themselves as leftists, socialist, Marxists, who dislike some of what I say about this will get very annoyed because they'll say, "No, obviously I don't think that." It's like, okay, well, if you don't think that, right, then why are we talking about racially targeted solutions, right? Why are we just talk about universalist solutions that that you want to, for both moral and strategic reasons, right? That both because the ideal of justice is demographically correct proportions living at every level of the economic hierarchy is a shitty conception of justice, and also because strategically there's no way, there's no mechanism, right? That if you can't get the majority of the population on board, it becomes much harder to see what the mechanism for achieving any of this stuff is. um, for both of those reasons, you should want universalist solutions. And I would say the same thing in Palestine. It's like, yeah, that's like if we got a binational state, right of return for refugees, but as Lillian says, returning refugees ended up living in substandard housing, currently lived in by Israeli Arabs, etc. What you're describing is the achievement of universal bourgeois democratic rights, which would be step one, right? But then this leaves quite a bit left to be done, right? To achieve justice, right? Like what's left is going from the second best idea to the best idea, right? That they have that's like, yes, um, obviously that leaves you with all sorts of inegalitarianism about the distribution of resources, and the particular shape of the inegalitarianism will obviously be shaped by the historical facts about racial discrimination in the U.S. or about dispossession in Palestine, etc. But either way, what I would argue is the sort of fundamentally objectionable feature there is not the fact that the pattern of distribution of economic inequality is shaped by those historical factors, but the economic inequality per se, right? I mean, it's like, yes, obvious, like, if you ever, so there's a newspaper people may be familiar with. They're sort of hysterical weirdos, but they're very memorable. It's called Workers' Vanguard.
Yeah.
That right. So they have this sort of screaming headline style that like starts with 4A and then whatever they want to happen and then an exclamation mark, right? So it's like, look, 4A socialist republic of Israel-Palestine, right? I mean, that would be the actual goal, right? And yes, obviously, we could have all the discussions you want to about what's sort of pragmatically can happen in the next 5 minutes, and I think that a binational state plus socialism would be my number one draft pick, and then binational bourgeois state wouldn't be quite as good as that, and two-state partition would be considerably worse than that, although considerably better than what exists right now, right? Like this is, and like what becomes.
You've become muffled and underwater. I don't know if you've unplugged your mic or
Oh
something.
no, not on purpose.
You're normal again now.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yes, absolutely, Kilgore. As part of a socialist federation of the Levant. Let's go for broke here. I mean, look, I don't like nationalism of any kind. I think nationalism is very bad. And I think most actually existing nationalisms could be tracked somewhere on a spectrum from pure ethnic nationalism to pure civic nationalism. But also, I think that pure civic nationalism kind of doesn't exist and sort of can't, because once you really say, well, this is just a collection of human beings, there's nothing that makes them different from any other human beings, then why, why bother with the nation state at all at that point, right? I mean, why not just, have a global socialist state, right? But I think that nationalism of any kind I don't love. The more it gets, the more ethno-nationalistic it gets, the less I love it. I'm actually not even like, I don't even like, I mean, I've actually kind of shifted on this over the years. I used to sort of go with the kind of standard Leninist line about, the right of nations to self-determination. And I actually have gotten to the point where it's like, what do we mean by nation exactly? Right?
Yeah,
like
no,
what?
I mean, I like nationalism when it serves socialism, and I don't like it when it doesn't.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not saying that like
how many land back people believe in the sovereign right of the Ukrainians to secede from the USSR,
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But yeah, like I think that
which I also don't believe in, but
yeah. I mean, I think that like the problem when you talk about the right of nations to self-determination, whether in the Wilsonian or the Leninist iteration of that, is trying to figure out exactly what you mean by nation. Because before you know it, it seems like you mean something that's suspiciously close to just ethnic group. And then you want to talk about the right of all nations to self-determination. It gets real messy, because you probably can't coherently believe in the right of all nations to self-determination, because there are too many conflicting claims about, what the nation is and, what land is its land and all that stuff. And so I think that what actually matters is that everybody has democratic rights, and you don't have, ethnic or, a racial or other forms of arbitrary domination. Like that matters. Where exactly the national boundary lines are drawn, I'm willing to be a bit utilitarian about, right? As long as we have nation states at all, think, well, try to cause the minimum amount of harm, right? In how you divide them up, But it's like, I think that there's a, if so, I'm all for national independence in situations where that's the best way to give large numbers of people democratic rights they would otherwise lack, right? But as the more it sort of feels like national independence for its own sake, that's like just kind of linked to ethno-national narratives, the less friendly I am to it. I mean, I'm not a big fan of, French Canadian nationalism, for example, right? This is,
I really get less and less enthused about Scottish nationalism every day. Though that's
yeah,
especially because they tie it to membership of the European Union, which is just completely backwards.
yeah. I mean, it's Scottish. Um, yeah, I mean, like this idea. It's like, I don't know, man. If you basically, if you basically do have equal rights within the existing nation, then I don't know that we need to draw another border that's going to, people aren't going to be able to freely cross back and forth. I do think the EU issue complicates it a little bit, I guess, because like at least then you have freedom of movement within, Scotland plus the rest of the EU. But although also
Oh yeah, I mean it would be a massive problem of the fact that obviously you have to have freedom of movement between England and Scotland. I mean, there's been permanent freedom of movement between Ireland and England for the entire time that Ireland has been independent, allegedly independent.
yeah,
Um,
that's
do you want to see an amazing pair of hater comments? These came one
sure,
after another in
sure.
the order I showed them.
Let's do it.
Okay, pretty
That is
normal.
bourgeois champion socialist. Yep.
Then
So you all have Neanderthal heritage. Yeah. Uh, yeah. Um, yeah. I don't think. Again, so I saw there was a chat about trying to have socialism while you have colonial contradictions in place. I think it depends what you mean, right? Like in other words, I think that if you want to say, well, you can't have, like, it's very hard to see how you could have socialism, which would involve like widespread working class unity without first getting rid of like a system of apartheid such as currently exists in Israel-Palestine, right? Like that. I think
I
that's
mean, the USSR didn't grant sovereignty to indigenous people. The
no.
China didn't grant sovereignty to the indigenous people. And obviously, you don't
Yeah,
really like those places, but this person presumably does like at least
yeah,
one of them.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I'm also not even sure that that would be my criticism of those places, right? Like that they have a like. I
Right.
think that I think that yeah, I think that you can. I think if by colonial contradictions you mean systems that deny lots of people bourgeois democratic rights, then I agree, right? That like you definitely do have to get rid of those on your way to having any hope of achieving socialism. But if by colonial contradictions you just mean national boundaries being drawn in the ways that don't sort of satisfy the longings of this or that, national movement, I would, here's where I kind of do get more Luxembourgy and less Lenin-y as I get older, because I think, if you actually read Lenin on the national question, his argument is, well, basically by supporting, and of course this is not his practice once he achieves state power, but put that aside, right? By supporting national self-determination, national independence, what you'll do is you'll take the national question off the table so that people can then focus on class struggle, the struggle for socialism. And I would submit that the last century of history since Lenin died doesn't, the empirical evidence doesn't seem to point that way, right? It does not really seem to be the case that, sort of successful national movements have this effect of getting everybody to think less about nationalism and, and to think more about socialism.
And not to think about, well, what if my nation could be a larger one?
Yeah, exactly. And what about this or that disputed territory? And, yeah, totally. This is, I think that at a certain point, you just have to, be willing to just, not be a nationalist and be a socialist instead.
Ben, can we somehow make next week about June 2? Have you seen it?
uh, oh, Dune 2. I have actually not seen it.
Oh,
It's
mate, sort your life out.
Yeah, fair enough. So there is no yeah, there is no yeah, actually, by the way, I like to Skellum's thing about the Neanderthal DNA and all that. I like after my original article, it inspired Uri Strauss to write this fun essay on Medium where he sort of worked out the math about, that like essentially shows that outside of maybe some extremely isolated tribes, everybody is descended from everybody at this point, right? That this is like, it takes, even in very insular groups, it takes very little intermarriage to make it the case that like everybody is at least in some tiny little extent descended from like everybody else who lived like at least a few hundred years ago. But so like all of those things people say like, oh, you know, there's this like some stat that's, I don't know where people get it anyway, or if it's true, but like people will like say, oh, such and such percentage of the world is descended from Genghis Khan. And you hear it, you're like, man, Genghis Khan really got around.
Yeah, and it's
Uh,
actually not that notable. Like
it's actually
any man that
totally
successfully reproduced at the time.
exactly. It's like, yeah, it's totally unremarkable. We're also all descended from any number of like random Mongolian peasants, right? Like it's
Yeah, it's stupid as soldiers.
exactly. But yeah, so there is no next week because next week is my birthday and I am
Okay,
going
well,
to.
there will be a next week where I'll celebrate Ben's birthday by talking about fan fiction
Oh yeah, nice. Yeah, just yeah, make sure you get it to me
with
like a couple.
Fakey13 from the chat, which I was going to do last week, everyone, but I was struck down with a migraine.
Yeah. Yep. So great, perfect. So yeah, do that. Just so I am going to celebrate by not being on YouTube and possibly also not checking Twitter. And
Yeah, sorry
yeah,
guys, the world's over.
there is
enjoy
no next week. Yeah, space time is coming to an end.
enjoy your
I'm
next
sorry.
between 1 and 9 hours, depending on your time zone.
Yeah, I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Yeah.
The
Yeah,
world is being eliminated in favor of an intergalactic bypass.
exactly. Yeah, you were all notified. There was a notification that was in the bottom drawer of a lock desk, etc. Yeah, which is, I actually think about that all the time when I see the stuff about how, oh, we actually sent the Palestinians a text message saying that we were about to bomb their house. So
Right.
I don't know why they didn't get out. It's
Yeah, I mean, in the latest poll about Palestine by the internal thing, their question about favorite television show in Gaza had become like a non-functional question due to the state of
yeah,
infrastructure.
yeah, exactly. Um, this is yeah, and also in a fun bit of extra irony here, people are regularly shot in Gaza as they're trying to like climb up to higher ground to get a cell phone signal. So,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, but um, but yeah, I am. There will be a next week, like ontologically, right? There will be a next week, but uh, there there will not be a me and Stefan talking on YouTube next week.
You're going to write an essay.
Uh, yes, I am going to write an essay. And the so we will have a couple to choose from by the time you and I see each other again in 2 weeks. But meanwhile, tune in, same place, same channel to watch Stefan talk about fanfic.
And I'm sure, I hope you all enjoyed our longest ever show. I hope you enjoyed it. If you hated it, which people do a lot, they enjoy what they hate. So I hope the haters and the lovers and everyone is pleased.
Fair enough.
And I will press the go away button. I always go to play the introduction.